Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may find yourself. My name is Harry Verhoeven, and welcome to this event organized by the Center on Global Energy Policy at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. It's my great pleasure to be introducing this event, which will tackle climate action in Nigeria. As many of you on this call will know, this is an extremely pressing and important subject, not least in light of the devastating floods that Nigeria had to contend with over the course of last year, and of which the damage is, of course, still being assessed and still being felt by the people of Nigeria. More than 600 people perished, of course, in these floods, more than 1.4 million people directly affected, mass displacement and concomitant economic damage. And in the call today, we will be trying to both focus a bit on questions of adaptation to climatic changes, but also, of course, on what Nigeria as a major oil producer can do on the mitigation side. And for that, we're very lucky to have with us at this moment in time, Muntaka Omar Sadiq, who will be introduced in just a minute by my colleague, Ariwula Ugbemi, who's kindly hosting this session with me. But before we do so, a few quick housekeeping issues. This event is live, it is being live streamed. It will also be recorded, so you can watch it again on YouTube or on other social media channels at a time of your choosing. It's also open to the press. And I therefore urge you, of course, to ask all your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen for our panelists to engage with. But please to be mindful that this is a public event, and therefore also to be respectful, of course, of one another's opinion, indeed of those of the panelists. One of our panelists, unfortunately, has been excused. Unfortunately, she's contending with an emergency situation on her end. But nonetheless, we'll be making a start. Ariwula, perhaps over to you to introduce our first speaker here, Dr. Muntaka, and to kick us off. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much, Harry. Do you hear me okay, everyone? Okay, so again, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for this event and this discussion. Really look forward to an engaging discussion. My name is Ariwula Ugbemi. Currently wear two hats, senior advisor for Equinor, a Norwegian energy company, and also currently adjunct research scholar at the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Muntaka Umar Sadiq. He's the co-lead of the Nigeria Energy Transition Office at the Office of the Vice President of Nigeria. He is the principal finance specialist mandated to develop and implement Nigeria's energy transition plan and secure an envisaged approximately 10 billion investment package for the transition plan. Muntaka has over 15 years of impact investing, energy financing, policy, and consulting experience in the energy sector. Muntaka, welcome. We're very happy to have you here. We have another speaker that we are hoping can connect. She's having, I think, some challenges with the tech, and hopefully she can connect while we continue this session. So I think to kick it off, Muntaka, welcome. As Harry said, the topic today is to talk about climate action in Nigeria. What are the risks? What are the urgencies? What are the opportunities? So maybe I can invite you to start with some of your reflections on this topic, sort of based on what you've been working on. Give us some sort of opening remarks or reflections from your perspective. Welcome, Muntaka.
Okay, I'm sure you can hear me now. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much to the center for the opportunity to sort of speak, learn, as well as share ideas with participants. What I'd like to do really is to try to do a couple of things. One is really to give some context around Nigeria's kind of position, both on the mitigation as well as the adaptation side. And I think secondly, perhaps to speak about how the country seeks to address some of its priority challenges using the lens of energy transition, and perhaps using Nigeria as a case study. But I think to begin with, the problems are almost quite well defined. We heard earlier, Nigeria is really confronted with a dual challenge. On the one hand, I think the issues around energy poverty, right? So I believe Nigeria is the biggest population block in terms of unelectrified populations, right? Over 90 million Nigerians lack access to electricity. Over 175 million Nigerians lack access to clean cooking solutions, for example. But at the same time, I think the country is really seeing the realities and impact of climate change happening sort of in real time, right? I think you mentioned the flood, the issues around desertification, erosion, and that has had a real impact, right? So over 3 million Nigerians were affected by the recent floods. Thousands have died. Over 300 hectares of land, farmlands affected, right? So we're talking about real impact both in terms of livelihoods as well as the quality of life. And I think the convergence of these issues have really informed why the country has really honed in and prioritized both climate action on the one hand, but also given the multiple transitions that we're seeing as a country, right? We're seeing the volatility of oil prices, fiscal constraints in terms of our wallet, our budget as a country on the back of the Ukraine crisis, as well as other economic headwinds. It is quite important to give ourselves as a country, and indeed more broadly as a nation, the space to industrialize, even as we try to address some of these climate-related challenges. And so 2 years ago in COP26, Mr. President sort of announced the country's ambitions around achieving net zero by 2060, and really rolled out a detailed energy transition plan. I believe Nigeria is the first country on the continent that has kind of outlined a detailed energy transition plan that on the one hand speaks to our plan to achieve universal access by 2030, but also outlines a pathway to kind of address some of the climate related challenges. Now, in terms of the how, on the one hand, I think the plan really speaks to, or I would say our thesis, our transition and climate thesis really is predicated on the fact that 65% of emissions in Nigeria are primarily related to energy consumption and industrial processes. Within that, there are priority sectors, particularly around oil and gas, industry, clean cooking, for example, transportation, buildings or clean cooking, power as well, which is sort of the fifth one. And so the country has, if you like, prioritized the biggest sources of emissions on the mitigation side, and use that as a basis of also developing, a carbon neutral energy system, so that we can address some of our priority economic challenges. And they involve things like, getting 100 million people, out of poverty, advance in terms of economic growth, provide modern energy services to the full population, and things like that. However, I think given the issues around erosions and floods, even as we create a plan around mitigation, net zero, it was important for us to stage some of our mitigation efforts with adaptation actions. All right. And so there is a lot of focus on the plan of using energy as an important enabler to adaptation. And by that, I mean almost, using robust energy systems to enhance local economies, to make them more resilient, to better understand the vulnerabilities, to integrate climate change risks, into more mainstream actions. But more importantly, to use energy to address our adaptation needs. And so there are examples of, scaling up mini grids and solar home systems to make communities a bit more productive and more resilient, using solar, or I would say hydro capacity to not just for power, but to help in terms of more resilient agricultural systems, right? In terms of crop and water control. And so that model of staging or phasing or better integrating mitigation, but resilience and adaptation, I think is primarily what a lot of what we are sort of focusing on. We see an important role in building these robust energy systems, also in things like providing emergency services or for cooling in the context of, increased warming climates, or for surveillance systems like the ICT, communication and transportation infrastructure. And so these overlaps, if you like, between, on the one hand, having an integrated adaptation plan, and on the other hand, having an energy transition plan that kind of lays out a path through these 5 priority sectors to both achieve our universal access to electricity goals, but also in a manner that achieves net zero in the longer term. As a final point, we have estimated that the energy transition plan will cost nearly $410 billion, in excess of business as usual spending. That translates into a $10 billion annual financing gap. And so and in order to achieve that, that is not something that the government can do alone. So much of our focus is really around the blend, really, between engaging the private sector, building a pipeline of projects. And these projects span across, things from LPG expansion to solar-powered independent power plants, to gas flare commercialization projects, to adaptation projects, both on the water or agricultural side. And curating this pipeline of projects has really been an important part of mobilizing resources towards achieving our short and long-term goals. We have seen also that that clean energy transitions really involve resources both from the private sector, but low-cost debt, off-balance structures, and international capital. So we spend a lot of time in terms of that advocacy to address or to improve the markets, the enabling policies to facilitate the sorts of investments required to achieve our goals. As a final point, the governance arrangement is such that we have an energy transition working group that includes all of the important multi-sectoral participants on the government side required, right? From environment to water to transportation to petroleum. Given the multi-sectoral aspect of adaptation and mitigation, which is chaired by the Vice President and supported by an Energy Transition Office, a law has been passed, which is our Climate Change Act, to kind of provide that institutional and legal framework to advance these efforts. Because you may be aware, in the context of Nigeria, we're having an election in a couple of weeks. So it is important, as we manage this political transition, it's a 40-year plan. So multiple political transitions will happen. But having kind of legally backed institutions and also the fiscal space to operate is an important part of it. In summary, our energy transition plan really is about diesel displacement, because the power sector is the single most important source of emissions, and that's largely driven by diesel and power gen sets. So our thesis is really that shift between going from these gen sets to more on and off grid sources of power, solar being at the heart of our discussion in the short term, but also gas as a transition fuel to industrialize and as a basis to kind of enhance our on-grid capacity, sort of the load related to that. And so yes, so I think deploying solar capacity at an unprecedented scale, about 5.3 gigawatts each year till 2060, on the one hand, but also kind of addressing or debottlenecking some of our on-grid issues, also through solar. Part of that energy mix is kind of an important part of that conversation, and using energy really as an entry point towards adaptation and enhancing some of the community-related resiliencies required is really the perspective from where I sit. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to give some color as to the important kind of levers, both in terms of our priorities to develop our economies, but also to do that in a manner where we are staging both mitigation-related investments alongside adaptation efforts. The last piece, I've said this a few times, but an important piece I would say is what we do around helping to shape the markets, right? Last year in COP, we saw announcements related to loss and damage funds. Nigeria also is focusing on developing the carbon markets. And because given all of the resources required to achieve our goals, to achieve both the short and long-term plans, more sustainable climate financing approaches around carbon markets development will be kind of an important part of this conversation. So I'll stop there for now and available to sort of answer further questions as we go along.
Thank you so much, Muntaka. That was great as a kind of general overview, I think, for our audience members. I think many of the points you made were very well taken, and I think both the audience members, but also me, myself, and Ayola would be keen to drill in a bit deeper into some of the specifics of what you're outlining. And for example, one of the first things that comes to mind is your emphasis, as you said, on also mobilizing private capital from Nigeria as well as perhaps from outside the country. Your points about developing these carbon markets, I think, is an important one. Could you talk us through some of the specifics on that score? Are you thinking here particularly of issuing certain types of bonds, for instance, and expanding that? Are we thinking here of perhaps some kind of joint investment in which the government puts forward some of money and you're inviting private investors to come along for some of the projects that you're outlining? Putting some flesh on the bone, I think there would be quite useful for some of our audience members as they try to understand what the landscape will look like in the next couple of years, or how you envisage at least that happening.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I think as an energy transition office, we are looking at a range of financing instruments to mobilize this $10 billion sort of annual financing gap. One of which really is around investment facilitation with our local private sector. And when I say local private sector, I mean the likes of, Tari from ARM Harris was, I think, meant to be part of this panel, but we have local private equity, local financing institutions that have mobilized resources, I guess in her case, about $300 million towards investing in energy transition projects, ESG projects. We have several of those, Chapel Hill, and it's important to have your local private sector invested, because that also shows the international community or international investors, it provides the right kind of signaling in terms of the appetite for investments within the space. Now, the form in which this happens is the following. One, the government has outlined a $23 billion investment opportunity and a short list of pipeline projects, like I mentioned earlier. And much of resource mobilization for the private sector is really around bankable projects. So going from a long list of projects to a short list of viable investment propositions that have the right investment requirements and enabling policies for, to get the return profile required. I think we're seeing that beyond these kind of ESG funds, we're seeing significant interest around blended financing. And so off-balance sheet structures, and I think we believe there's an institution called InfraCredits that helps in terms of addressing some of or mitigating some of the risks around, local currency, around our FX issues and things like that. But low-cost debt or concessionary financing is sort of an important piece of that conversation as well. And so in terms of that local private sector support, it has largely been around helping develop a pipeline of projects, because the uses and sources of funds have to be aligned, but also a blend of low-cost debt and off-balance sheet structures to then complement other international capital. Nigeria also has a sovereign investment authority who also focus on energy transition related projects. And by that, I mean, solar farms, solar power and independent power plants. In the context of Nigeria, some gas flare related projects, scaling up interconnected mini grids. So that's one aspect of getting our local private sector to be responsive to the investment pipeline. Now, for that to happen, and in our case, what we have seen is that the government also has an important role in two particular areas. One has been around removing some of the constraints towards investments. So in our case, it was liberalizing the licensing for mini grids to go from 1 megawatts to get a license to 5 megawatts to enhance that deployment required for solar. Issues around dispatch orders, access to capital constraints, things around VAT and taxes. So the government has an important role in removing all of the bottlenecks to facilitate the sorts of investments required from the private sector. So that's one piece. The second important piece is really on the sovereign side, right? So Nigeria has a history of issuing green bonds twice, right? Towards both mitigation and adaptation projects, right? Some in terms of gully constructions, hydro. And so that has been an important model that the country has used in the past in terms of issuing bonds both at a national as well as a subnational level. So that's two. The third important piece, and I think we may see some relevance of this going forward, is in terms of climate debt for climate swaps, right? Most African countries, I see, Ghana going through economic headwinds similar to Nigeria. Given what's going on, we see a situation where going forward, given the debt profile of some of these countries, there might be opportunities to almost enhance clean energy swaps towards eroding some of the debt profiles of the country. So that's one of the innovative financing mechanisms that we see as an important part of this discussion. The last piece is around the JET piece. There are three important case studies. That's the Just Energy Transition Partnership. South Africa, for example, 2 years ago announced $8.4 billion, supported by, the G7, European Union, G7. Last year during COP, we heard similar announcements from Indonesia, $20 billion, 10 towards the public sector, 10 towards the private sector. And so a few African countries, Senegal, Nigeria, are now exploring partnership opportunities with the EU and G7 around what a JET-P partnership may look like within our setting. In much of these other settings, the JET-P partnership has largely been around decommissioning coal, as a basis for mobilizing those resources. In our case, in Nigeria, our thesis, like I mentioned earlier, is really around diesel displacement and kind of deploying solar capacity at sort of an unprecedented scale. So we're quite excited about the opportunities to advance that partnership going forward. Yeah. So for us, the private sector is an important piece of mobilizing resources, but it complements a number of other financing efforts that we're advancing. One of such efforts too is really around the carbon markets. We think that as a country, if you consider that it's about $20 per capita for carbon credits, and you do the build up of that analysis, we estimate that we can raise about $800 million every year through sort of carbon credits, the voluntary carbon credits. And we now have institutions in country, though on the compliance side, to begin to provide the regulatory framework for that to happen. And that includes things like, intermediation and financing, building the supply, credit ecosystem, advanced market commitments. Last year during the COP, $400 million of advanced market commitments towards, carbon markets was announced. So we see this as an important financing trend across the continent.
All right, thank you so much for that, Muntaka. I know my colleague Arewula has a question which she wants to tie also to some of the questions that are coming in through the Q&A, where there's a whole flood of reactions streaming into the interesting things you're sharing with us, Muntaka. But Arewula, why don't you put forward your question and tie it to some of the activity there?
Great. So thanks so much, Muntaka. I think your response on the financing part is really, really interesting. A lot of different solutions there. I think it would have been great if we had Tariye to also kind of put some perspective on that, but maybe next time. My question that sort of occurred to me when you were giving your introductory remarks, and then I saw that there was a question in the comments that's also linked to that, so I'll just combine them. Has to do with how the Energy Transition Office is working with other agencies, with regards to climate action? Because of course, this is kind of multifaceted. Of course, there's the energy sector, there's the environment, there's housing, there's planning, there's transportation. And the question in the chat is from Dr. Donna Rubinoff, and she refers to work she did with the Federal Ministry of Works and Housing to prepare a 2023 National Urban Development Policy. And how a lot of the work in that, recommendations in that policy, just trying to find the question here, is very much some of the issues that you've highlighted, and she kind of encourages you to work closely or to engage with the Federal Ministry of Works and Housing. I'm just thinking there will be other agencies like that. Everybody has their own kind of action plan. So how do you align? How do you coordinate? How do you ensure that you're all working together towards the same goal?
No, I think that's a great question, and I'll provide this context. One of the trade-offs of being the first country on the continent, I mean, Nigerians were very dramatic about being pioneers of everything across the continent. But I think one of the trade-offs of being the first to have an approved detailed energy transition plan and really solving for getting our Federal Executive Council to approve such a plan is that some of that stakeholder engagement and inclusivity required to engage, get policy coherence, coordination, and alignment becomes somewhat suboptimal, and we recognize that. One is we have given our governance arrangement with the Vice President chairing an energy transition working group that includes all of the ministries, and in fact, more recently, with the National Council on Climate Change, that includes every minister from, all of the above: environment, power, housing, transportation. That has helped in not just policy alignment, but also in the coordination, internal government coordination and alignment, to speak with one voice and have some kind of coherence. In fact, when I started this role, I underestimated the degree of heavy lifting required to get all of the moving parts in government to speak in one voice. In fact, I would say that is most of what we have done. There was there was this energy transition plan. We had the folks in the Ministry of Petroleum that had kind of developed their own versions of an energy transition plan. We had an energy transition plan that was of course, you're aware of the NDC. So the alignment, there's an overlap in nearly 97% of both plans. However, in terms of how each of those plans looks at transportation, meaning EV, energy transition plan speaks a lot more to, electric vehicles, charging and all of that, whilst NDC speaks to, CNG, so leveraging gas a bit further. Energy transition plan is concerned about, the fact that automobiles are really, in the context of Nigeria, second-hand stocks and some of the stranded capacity that may be required. So it makes so there is also policy alignment even within government that needs to happen in terms of NDC, energy transition plan, particularly in that one small piece. And so having such a platform, the Energy Transition Working Group, to build consensus around government position took a while, but happened. Same thing, there were a number of versions of energy transition plans, but the multi-sectoral, in my previous life, I was in the health sector. And typically what we find is that in terms of social determinants of policy action or health that are typically multi-sectoral, it often takes time to get the degree of policy coherence, coordination, and alignment to drive action. What is typically helpful is evidence. And so we have, two stakeholder engagement. So on our side, the Ministry of Environment, Power, and actually now housing, right? So an important, so in fact, there's someone in my team that focuses on, things around resilient homes. So even in terms of the adaptation efforts, even things around cooling. And I'm aware of that policy, and we're kind of making efforts. In the context of Nigeria, you also find that we don't have we we don't have issues around developing policies. We have all of the policies everywhere. The issue has really been around execution and policy alignment and sort of enforcement, right? So we're spending a lot of time sort of getting the whole ship to speak with one voice and also implement accordingly. But just to totally agree with you, that I think we have advanced a lot further with the lower hanging sectors. So the power, even a bit with oil and gas and environment, but with the likes of water resources, but also housing, there is still some work to be done. But I think we're working towards further aligning in those efforts.
Thanks, Muntaka. I think that point is well taken indeed about Nigeria having a long history of lots of plans and perhaps good intentions, but of course for the majority, or at least many of its people, often very, very disappointing results. So good to hear about all this coordination and this good thinking about alignment. Now, there's two more questions in the chat that kind of are linked to this. One question I think by Felix, the other a point raised by Olarinre, both of them actually to do with monitoring, with evaluation, with getting the numbers right, and how do we know that action is actually happening, both I guess from a private sector perspective, where it's very important you need to be able to verify that emission reductions are actually happening, or to be able to quantify the effects of certain kind of adaptation measures, but also more generally for the Nigerian public and international partners to have confidence in all the things that you're mentioning. Can you speak a bit to that, to this kind of issues of how do we know what we know, monitoring, evaluation, reporting? I think that would be much appreciated.
Okay, so I think there's an underlying systemic issue around data in Nigeria. When it comes to data, we're coming from a low-level equilibrium, just to be upfront about that. What we're seeing is that a lot of the data, whether it's population-based surveys or programmatic data, are typically housed within donor partners, territories, if you like. Institutionally in government, with the National Bureau of Statistics, I think we're seeing some efforts towards having more indigenous sources of data. 3 is the Ministry of Environment, the DCC, the Directorate of Climate, the Department of Climate Change, but also now more recently, the National Council on Climate Change is really focusing on that, on the, because one, there's just this, like significant asymmetry of data collection sources, the synthesis around aggregating data, also the information, the digital information systems, the surveillance systems at the front lines. I think we are not absolutely where we need to be. From that perspective, in the Energy Transition Office, we have seen that, we've been quite surprised that there has been, some data if you know where to look at. And I think that has been the problem in terms of, pulling together all the various data sets, but doing that in a manner that is quite, aggregating them in a manner that is visible, open, accountable, so I think, there's data within certain departments in the ministry, but having that portal that gives the confidence, right? I think that has been an important issue, but I think now there is an institution within the NCC focusing primarily on the important baselines required, the decarbonization milestones, the impact metrics, both on the decarbonization side, but also in terms of universal access. So I know there's a framework being developed for that, but the ministry does have kind of baseline data related to not just the NDCs, but even as the energy transition plan was being developed to kind of set those targets, but provide a framework for measuring. The other important piece of what I want to add was that, surprisingly, what we have found is that it's one thing to have the sources of data. There are various sources, actually. I mean, ultimately, if you know where to find, and much work has to be done in terms of making that a bit more visible. But we find that the supply side of data is less of a hurdle to the demand side of data, right? So using data to inform policy action, to inform performance management actions, visioning and targeting, that culture of delivery within the public sector is missing. So you would see several investments towards data systems and different donors and programs doing different things, whether it's nature-based solution, baselining, or adaptation mitigation efforts, they exist. But I think the fact that the demand for that data and using it in a way that can inform interventions, I think that capacity is missing. And that's why you see a lot of false efforts when it comes to improving our data systems and equilibrium. I think that's kind of an area that we are hoping to have, because ultimately, if you look at, to achieve our decarbonization targets, or in the case of the National Council on Climate Change, being able to trade carbon or, being able to measure offsets needs to be, that currency for performance needs to be verifiable, and with accountability end to end. And so the NCC is really focusing on at least building out these sort of data systems so that the market, in terms of the currency for carbon credit, that there's an important benchmark to use for that. So I would just summarize by saying that we're absolutely not, not just in climate, in many other sectors. I think data systems, both on the supply and demand side, continue to be an issue. And in places where we even have the data, we find that they are aggregated. So we're not talking about disaggregated data pools. We are not talking about having really robust surveillance systems that can give us a better sense of risk and adaptation technologies and things like that. So we are in a low-level equilibrium, and as part of achieving our goal, the data, which we put under performance management more broadly, and market shaping, is an important kind of piece of that conversation. But I kind of just wanted to give the context and landscape going forward. Final point, actually, because we have at least from our office perspective, we have done a lot of work around an integrated energy planning tool, right? Which has provided more market intelligence around clean cooking, mini grids, some of the kind of nature-based solutions type data. And so this kind of large integrated energy planning tools exist. And in fact, we have tried to kind of make that as public as possible. But what has been interesting is that it has helped the private sector, for example, better understand the catchment areas or the least cost investment propositions for different types of opportunities in different jurisdictions. And so I wish Taria was here, but the infra credits alongside ARM have used some of this integrated energy planning tool for both clean cooking, mini grids, to inform their investments, actually. And so we have seen the power of what data can do, not just in terms of kind of visioning, planning, like baseline, targeting, and monitoring and evaluating in terms of impact evaluations, but also how important it is to signal or provide the sort of market intelligence that is required by the private sector to invest.
Thank you so much. I think really great points there about the importance of data. I want to take a couple of questions. First of all, I want to thank the participants in this, because there's a lot of good questions and a lot of engagement. So, I mean, it's really great. So thanks, and keep the questions coming. There's a couple of questions here that are related, and also kind of one of the things that struck me in your initial opening, where you said that, the Energy Transition Office and how you work, you plan to use energy as an entry point towards adaptation and resilience. And there's a couple of questions here, one from Benjamin and also one from Lamia, is how do you, can you elaborate on that kind of thinking or that strategy? Another question that's somewhat related talks about, the energy sector being the #1 source of emission, but you also have, a lot of biomass and biomass and waste representing a lot of Nigeria's energy consumption. So how do you kind of manage that in this context of, you can't necessarily expand the grid? So how do you manage that in the context of the saying that you're using energy as an entry point to mitigation, adaptation, and resilience? Could you say a bit more on that? Thanks.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I think that really was just so thanks very much I think those are great questions. And actually, you're highlighting themes that we've spent a lot of time grappling with and kind of reflecting on. So I think this is an opportunity to really just co-create. So I think when we say energy as an important enabler, it's really just from the perspective of the Energy Transition Office, right? I think that we see complementarities, right, between the fact that energy is quite cross-cutting, right, both in terms of the productive use and, you know, really building resilience in, you know, local community. So almost local community resilience, and seeing that as the important hub, right? And the role that kind of energy plays in all as an important lever for all of the different sectors, right? So whether it's boreholes, water control, diversions for irrigation, ICTs, emergency services for health, is really just to be able to optimize the role of energy to help both in terms of the actual and potential risks of climate change, right? And even in terms of the productive use cases, so equipping communities with, you know, productive uses and wealth that make them adapt better, right? And cooling. So that entry point of the important role that, you know, solar can have for cooling, for example. So you can see how, at least to a large extent, or the importance of energy for, you know, better management, growth and storage for agricultural crops, so agricultural management systems, for importance of energy in terms of construction of gullies, which we see happen, or even the local community participation in these efforts. So I think it was just our way of talking about the integration, the innovative integration required at that community level, and the use and the role that energy can play in advancing those efforts. I think the other related theme, I think, mentioned around both biomass and waste management. I think that is absolutely an important aspect of it. I mean, waste, for example, is one of the important sources. If you look at Lagos, even in the South, for flooding, right? And so waste management, both in terms of the management and translation of that from inputs to the processing of it, and the role of energy, I think, is an important thing. And we're seeing the role of technology in terms of harnessing that, right? As we think more broadly around circular economy and things related to that, even down to creating jobs. You know, like Lagos is about to embark on an effort related to this. Now, in terms of biomass and waste related, so I think that the way we see it, it features in two places. One is that energy and industrial processes, inclusive absolutely of waste management, biomass, because they're all quite related, is related to some of both the energy consumption and the fallout of them. We have, in terms of the energy and industry space, look at biomass also in terms of clean cooking. And I'll just spend some time speaking to some of that, of the relationships. Clean cooking in Nigeria, people currently use, cow dung in terms of cooking, like it is the reality in our setting. If you look at the recent poverty indicator survey by the Bureau of Statistics, I mean, one of the most dominant, sources of cooking is that. So it's clean cooking, it's kerosene, it's firewood. And so that shift towards cleaner sources like LPG, biogas, as well as electric stoves, is really an important part of what we are trying to do. But also doing that in a manner where, we look at the impact of clean cooking with respect to gender, health, and also deforestation. And so, so that shift towards cleaner sources, harnessing both biogas and e-cooking is another kind of part of the conversation. But I want to say that one of the important limitations of the energy transition plan, it is a living document. And if there are three areas that I wish we did more in terms of focusing on, One is, I would say, is really around agriculture and things related to that. I mean, it's a big source of our economy, our non-oil GDP in terms of jobs. And so if there's the next iteration of the energy transition plan, I think will go beyond the biggest sources of emission, which we've used that approach, right, in terms of, industrialization, right? But obviously, if you kind of compare that to some of the jobs that we're seeing, so land use and forestation, for example, I think would be an important piece if we're going to do the next phase of this. So that's one. But also, I think another important area is around waste management, actually, because I think this is another area that plays in the sweet spot between adaptation on the one hand, but also with the sort of technologies that we're seeing around the processing and what that can mean both in terms of advancing economic objectives, is another area where I think there are opportunities to do more. Final point is that when you look more broadly at the Africa carbon markets, what you would find is that in terms of advanced market commitments, right, the purchasers of carbon credits, the kind of projects that they are prioritizing are largely around, forestry and land use, clean cooking projects, natural-based solutions, waste management sort of investments. And so I think those important themes, this is in the context of Africa, are areas that we kind of need to do more to kind of develop the synergies between the needs of the carbon or climate market and the capabilities of the private sector to engage in those efforts.
Great. Thank you so much, Muntaka. And yeah, thanks for holding the fort. I think as the sole panelist up until now, and I'm so glad to see that Professor Adelekun has been able to call in. I know that we had some technical challenges, and it's really great that she has joined. So I see she has joined, and I'll just do a brief introduction of her before I hand the word to her. Professor Ibidun Adelekun is a geographer by training and a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. She focuses on climate, society interactions, and human dimensions of global environmental change, including the vulnerability, resilience of human environment systems to climate change. She is a leading scholar on the continent and beyond, and has written extensively on climate adaptation and governance challenges. She has also been a contributing editor to the Africa chapter of the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report and a member of the scientific panel of the International Geographical Union. Welcome, Professor Adelekun. I'm really, really glad to have you with us today. I think I will hand it to you. We've been talking on this topic on climate action, risks, opportunities, urgencies. So we'll be really happy to hear your perspectives, on this topic based on, all the work you've been doing. And yeah, if you share some of your initial thoughts with us, I'll hand the word to you. Thank you. Yeah, on mute, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Yes, I'm sorry, I'm just able to join the webinar, but I'd just like to say a few words based on my work and on, well, the most recent flooding in Nigeria, which occurred last year, 2022. That was 10 years, exactly 10 years after the major widespread flood of the year 2011. And you would wonder why we had so much damage, so much loss, so many people displaced, over 600 people killed also, houses destroyed. I mean, it was like a repeat, full-blown repeat of what happened in 2011. And apart from that, you have in different areas, in different cities, flood impacts, flooding events, So both cities and rural areas, for the 2022, you had many farmlands also, several hectares of farmland washed away. And one thing I would like to say is that Nigeria is a highly populated country. So with the population increase, rapid population growth, you have increase in built up areas, more deforestation taking place, vegetation cover giving way to artificial surfaces. And then, if we base our development planning on what we had in the past, then we are in trouble. And that's likely what is going on in terms of building codes, in terms of urban planning regulations. I think there is need for more enforcement of urban planning and regional planning regulations, because much of what is happening is business as usual, okay? And if you have business as usual, then based on changes in the climate, changing rainfall patterns and regimes, more wet, heavy rainfall, then you have the runoff, the runoff is, the stormwater runoff is high. And then that means the drainage channels cannot cope, the capacity of the drainage channels cannot cope with the storm runoff that is being produced. And that is why we're having more flooding. And then also, there is need for increased stakeholder collaboration, okay? Not just the government making policies, without recourse to the community members who are very, very attuned with their environments. And if they are not brought into the discourse, then we'll be doing more of theory than, practice, because the input that they have, okay, citizen knowledge is very important, not just the theoretical knowledge. And also, apart from that, there's need for collaboration also between scientists and government ministries, government agencies, so that our data, our findings as we go to the field needs to be put into the box as the policies and regulations are being made. Then also, I'd like to talk about the fact that we need more of local context. Local context, the characteristics of our local environment need to be taken into consideration, because if we don't take that into consideration, then the risks that people face, we will not be able to address them appropriately. We need to have this knowledge so that whatever we come up with will be relevant. For example, if government does not take into consideration the needs of the people in terms of their vulnerabilities, in terms of their needs, then the social aspect, which is very important, social protection, which is very important in reducing vulnerabilities, will still be lacking. Not just structural measures. We need to take into cognizance non-structural measures. And this aspect is very important and is mostly lacking in all our attempts, or in most of government attempts, to address the issues of climate risk management. We need to take into consideration non-structural measures and also citizen education and awareness raising. These are just some of the important aspects that we find that is very needful in terms of moving forward in adaptation governance, in flood risk management, and in trying to, advance our efforts in building resilience of citizens to the flood risks and other climate risks that they face. I think that's something I would like to leave. I know much of the time has gone, but that aspect is very important. Social protection is important. Social vulnerability is important, not just structural measures, but we should look at non-structural measures also. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Irene. I think there's some great points indeed. And I've also seen the chat, there's been quite a few questions related to some of the issues that you're highlighting, the importance, for example, of local knowledge. But there's also some questions here about the importance of forestry, in the debates about forestation and deforestation in Nigerian context. And I wonder whether you could speak a bit to that, because obviously that's a point that's quite important, both in terms of the issues you raised with regard to the built environment, regarding to migration, of course, rural-urban shift. How do you see the role, indeed, of forestry, and indeed a better management of forestry in the Nigerian context, and the way that may also help determine vulnerability, or hopefully lesser vulnerability in the future to floods such as the Calabamas, as ones that we saw in 2011, as well as last year?
Yes, forest management is very important, because there is a connection between forest management and watershed management. Okay, and if we want to do our best to reduce flooding, for example, the hydrological aspect is very, very important. Okay, because when you have your forests, then the leaves and all the canopy of the vegetation, they hold part of the water, and the impact. Water doesn't just go straight to the ground. You have interception and so on. But when you just continue to destroy the forest, then in terms of the hydrological flux, there is a problem. And that is a very important aspect when in terms of flooding. The more vegetation cover you have, the better you have in terms of reducing your runoff. Okay, and then that means the environment is able to deal with the water, much water that is coming down. So that is an important issue. Forests is very important when you have, and that's why we also say that it is important. I mean, when you're talking about climate change, people are encouraged to plant trees. Apart from trees having they play the role of mitigation in terms of taking in carbon dioxide, but then with trees also, there is a lot that it deals with in terms of how rainfall is distributed in the basin. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Adelekun. A question I had, and it's related to a couple of them in the chat, and I would like to sort of connect what Muntaka has been sharing with us. Muntaka has been sharing with us the Nigeria Energy Transition Plan and how they plan to work over the next few years towards net zero in 2060. So I want to link a bit a point you made. You talked about the need for collaboration, and you talked about broad stakeholder engagement sort of being key. You talked about input from sort of the citizens, getting citizen knowledge, need for collaboration between scientists and government agencies. And also one of the questions in the chat earlier was about involving the citizens, increasing their knowledge of energy transition, and having them participate in this journey, basically. So I think maybe I'll just open the question to you both. Muntaka, you talked already about cross-agency work. How are you also incorporating input from the citizens and also input from scientists, academia? And then also maybe hear a bit about Professor Adelekun's probably experience in regards to input to government policies in this area. Maybe Muntaka, you go first, and then we'll have Professor Adelekun respond.
So I think perhaps the only thing to add there really is that as part of the kind of stakeholder engagement, I think beyond the groups, the private sector groups, or the kind of labor, oil and gas groups, because of the trade-offs around the important skill shifting required, from oil to gas to even to renewables. But what we have found to be incredibly important is really engagement around civil society, but also community participation. Now we have prioritized women and youth groups because our plan really speaks to clean cooking, right? And for us, the most critical stakeholder is really around, gender. And so we're seeing the importance of engaging at that community at the front lines, using traditional institutions, but also women and youth groups, primarily around the dissemination of data. So that awareness is critical, right? We always speak about the influence model and the importance, right, of one, enhancing understanding and conviction of, for example, in our case, going from the use of firewoods and kerosene to cleaner sources of cooking, right, like LPG. I think that requires a degree of kind of data dissemination, awareness. That's one. But secondly, is really around some of the needs around role modeling, right? Particularly at the community level, right? So, who are the women or opinion leaders they look at the front lines, the role of traditional institutions. So, I mean, once again, in the case of clean cooking, what we're hearing is that there are lots of cultural habits at the front line, right? People prefer the taste of food when it comes from charcoal, for example. And I think these the culture and habits, right, to shape behavior, goes beyond building their capacity, enhancing understanding and conviction, using role modeling, but understanding also the right incentives and disincentives, right? So in our case, that really speaks to some of the issues around affordability, right? If you want to enhance the use of LPG within those settings, what are the innovative financing mechanisms that we can do to reduce the switching costs required? Can we incorporate, for example, carbon offsets as a collateral for them, as a sweetener? And so the incentives and disincentives at the front line. And so we're looking at kind of community participation from those perspective, the influence models. I think that's an important piece. And I think more broadly, for us, it's in most of the communities and the wards across the country, you have ward development committees that help to enhance not just community participation, but the accountability for action. And I think we're also seeing, right, that importance of that community ownership in the surveillance, so understanding priority needs, vulnerability needs, adaptation needs at the front lines. And I think the earlier comment is totally right. I mean, the lack of engagement or inclusivity of inputs at the community level, has been detrimental towards the effort. So I think that has actually been an important learning. But more broadly, in the case of, for example, in our case, the Niger Delta, right, for obvious reasons in terms of oil and gas and the experience there, that engagement as to the important trade-offs around job opportunities, that has come to the fore. Reskilling, retooling has been an important part of the conversation as we kind of engage in those efforts. So absolutely, I think that kind of community participation is an important piece of the inclusivity and buy-in actually supported to achieve both our short and long-term goals. But I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, in terms of energy, I'd like to bring the dimension of transportation, okay, because the population, when we're talking about Africa, urban Africa, with population growth, you need people to move from place to place. And that means transportation is a very important aspect of the whole discourse in terms of climate change because of the emissions from transport. And one of the major problems or key problems that we have in Nigeria, I'll talk about Nigeria, and indeed many cities of Africa, is the problem of transportation. The number as the countries develop, okay, with development, you're having more vehicles on the road. You have more vehicles on the road. As people also attain better economic status, they tend to, have their vehicles, and you have homes with more than 2 vehicles in some instances. Okay, and then you have this this large number of imported used vehicles, and with all the emissions and problems associated with used vehicles. So when we're talking about energy, and with all this on the road, all these vehicles on the road, large fleet of vehicles on the road, you have huge emissions, the emissions that greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, as a result of combustion. And I think it's very, very important, if we are talking about climate change, that we will have good public transportation. I think in Nigeria, the only city that is really doing well in terms of the bus rapid transport, BRT, is Lagos. And that means that there is public transport for people, large numbers of people to use. In the city where I live, Ibadan, there is a big problem of transport. And with increasing urban development or urban growth, the cities are sprawling. People are living outside, far from the city center, and they need to come to the city center to work. That means more journeys are being made. And then also in terms of where people are building. So if you have good transportation, that will be public transportation. And that is where one area in which government has not been able to meet the challenge, considering the population growth. But where we have good public transport, then in terms of energy use for transportation, we will be reducing the energy use, especially in terms of fossil fuel, petrol, burning. We don't have trains within the city environment largely, to move people from place to place. In terms of even water transportation, it's very, very limited. So we use vehicles, and with the increasing number of vehicles on the road, we're having more emissions. And that, if we're able to do significantly in addressing that component, I think we'll be going forward a long distance. So that's one aspect that needs to be considered in the development planning efforts of city governments, of state governments. The aspect of public transportation system has to be an important area to be considered. I think that's one point I want to talk about in terms of energy use. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, in the interest of time, I think we're going to draw this to a close, but perhaps direct a final question to each of you that might be worth considering. Muntaka, perhaps first to you. For many decades, Nigeria has been an oil exporter. Of course, I think it's been a member since OPEC since 1970 or 1971, if I'm not mistaken. I heard you saying at the onset, of course, the importance of finally making a breakthrough in ensuring that there's universal access to electricity among the entire population of the country. For people calling in from around the world, what is different about this time around that Nigerian government will finally be able to meet its plans to finally deliver this by 2030, as you said? Is it the political context that is different? Would you argue that institutionally we're talking about a different setup? Is it a better use of instruments? If you could speak a bit about that, I think that would touch on a number of the questions that have been posed in the chat about why is this time different. And finally, of course, to you, Professor Adedekan, there's one question by Amina Ibrahim that I saw posed in the chat, which might be relevant. She's drawing attention to the fact that there is greater emphasis at the international level on discussions about loss and damages, and some talk about, of course, an international fund being set up in order for countries like Nigeria and others to take advantage of this. How optimistic or how skeptical are you when you hear these kind of discussions happening at the global level, that they will actually make a meaningful difference in terms of the kind of vulnerabilities, the social vulnerabilities that you have highlighted? Is this something that Africans, Nigerians should put a lot of store in, or are real world solutions likely to come from other avenues than perhaps these kind of international funds as they pertain, or discussions as they pertain to loss and damage? But perhaps we first start with Muntaka, and then we come to you.
Sure. I think oftentimes when we understand the context, I mean, I think you're right. We have, we cannot, current programs or, programs in the past have been inadequate and necessitated bold innovations to sort of accelerate efforts. In addition, we have seen significant investments, you're totally right, with the use of oil proceeds towards powering our economy without commensurate results in terms of outcomes. And so to your question, in terms of what is different, I would say that on the one hand, the political economy and the political will, right, to develop a plan and provide the governance arrangement to execute it. That's one. Two, and for that, the kind of the political will to advance in prioritizing infrastructure projects and energy-related investments, both on and off grid. The second, I would say, is really around technology, and I think that the focus on the one hand on debottlenecking on grid and enhancing the energy mix towards kind of cleaner sources, I think is quite an intentional effort. But also we have seen the scale up of off-grid technologies, right? So mini grids, solar home systems from the Solar Power Nigeria project, and what the likes of the rural electrification agency is doing, starting off with 1 million connections, serving both underserved and unserved communities. So I think that too is kind of an important piece of the conversation, right? So even as we try to take on more that, we are really accelerating towards scaling up off-grid approaches. I think that hasn't part of the story. The third really is the focus on gas, right? So we have spoken about gas being an important transition fuel, and significant investments towards gas infrastructure has happened over the last few years, whether it's the AKK or Trans-Saharan pipeline and things like that. And in fact, we've been having conversations with the EU related to this. So that is quite new. And as a final piece, I would say around the policy and regulatory environment. And so there have been quick wins around addressing some of the bottlenecks related to dispatch orders, related to licensing, related to taxes, linked to some of the important inputs around mini grids and clean cooking technologies. And I would say the last piece is really around the macro factors, right? So as we think through the cost curve of some of these technologies, I think increasingly we're seeing solar technologies, the cost coming down, right? And more being a lot more viable in terms of a more sustainable model to deploy across the communities in Nigeria. So incorporating some of that solar capacity for clean cooking in terms of e-cooking and using productive use cases. So school, we're using that models to enhance the productive use case of energy, to also enhance our small and medium-sized enterprises, because that is an important piece of our economic story. And I think these are the important elements and changes that we have seen. We also recognize that the risks persists, both in terms of volatility of oil prices, but also there's a political transition, and also the enforcement capacity in government to make this happen. But within that context, I think we have seen some advances in some quick wins to build momentum around bigger bets in the future.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Muntaka. Imogen, over to you for some thoughts, as I said, on how these global discussions around loss and damage may or may not connect to the realities of people across Nigeria.
Yes, there's so much discussion, talk about loss and damage in the international sphere. But I personally feel that when you talk about loss and damage, the harm is already done, and you are trying to quantify or now address to recompensate or recover from the loss and damage. But I think in the local context, we should not focus. What we should be focusing on is not loss and damage, but how to develop in such a way that we are climate resilient, so that we do not record so much loss and damage that we are not looking forward to international agencies, funds from outside our borders, from international bodies to assist. I think that should be the focus: climate resilient development. Are we building our roads well, so that when the floods come, you don't have damage to bridges and roads that will hinder transportation, and then all the goods and services that ought to take place will not be readily available, or people will not be able to get to health facilities in time, and then people will die, now be recording so much deaths or so much damages to different in terms of loss of farmlands, crops, and so on, and then losses to the economy and so on. I think we should not be focusing. What we should do is to try to prevent the loss and the damages, not how to pay for or recover from the loss and damages. Because you talk about the 2012 floods, and you had different countries coming to the assistance of Nigeria. You had UNDP assisting, the World Bank coming there, and and then much funding went into it. I think what we should be doing is, we should have funds from the private sector, from the public sector, from multinationals, to help us to build, so that our development planning, our infrastructure will be resilient to the climate risks that we anticipate, or we are facing, or we anticipate to face in the future, so that we will not record so much loss, we will not record so much damage. I think that is supposed to be what we should be looking at. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you again also to Montaka. I appreciate the input from both of you very much. And as I think you can see from the Q&A, this has been an incredibly appreciated, robust discussion. We apologize again for the late start, but we're delighted that we were able to have this conversation. Unfortunately, it is 1:30 or past 1:30 here in New York, which means that we have to bring the discussion to a close. But very much appreciated again to our audience members, and especially, of course, to our two distinguished panelists who've taken us through such a great deal of issues and a great range of different questions. We very much look forward to seeing all of you, members of the audience, at future events that we organize here at the Center on Global Energy Policy, whether pertaining to Nigeria, Africa, or indeed to other issues. Thank you very much indeed, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day wherever you may find yourself around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Montaka. Thank you, Professor Adeleko. Thank you so much. Thanks to the audience.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
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 Bye.